you can say that probably the time of the opening was a good time, an appropriate time. I was impressed by how much in the streets themselves bicycles were the dominant mode of transportation, which is very, very hard even to imagine now, really. Well, I mean, China was in a tough position in many ways in its early years. Obviously, the new China, whatever. But anyway, from a sort of looking at it from a distant viewpoint, you can say that probably the time of the opening was a good time, an appropriate time for it to happen, because China at this point had developed economically and in other ways to the extent that it could be done. Without sort of, putting the country back in jeopardy in any sense. I mean, the word globalization was not something that Marx used, but I mean, he had those ideas which became known as globalization in the 80s and 90s of the last century. And so, I mean, what made him that is, of course, well, I mean, he does say in the Communist Manifesto, which of course was jointly written with Engels, but it's mostly Marx, that the workers have no country and so forth. And, it's workers of the world unite, so of the world, so that's the globalization idea right there. He talks quite extensively at the beginning about economic connections between nations and so forth. And then about the role of China in all this, I mean, of the opening up, of course. I mean, I think maybe Marx's ideas have had a certain, have provided a certain, you think of the horse's blinkers, had provided certain guidelines in terms of that development that would otherwise not have been understood, and maybe these not have been observed. Guidelines about just allowing unlimited capitalist enterprise without restrictions, without rules, and so forth. I mean, certainly there is at least a strong belief on the part of the government, which I think comes in part from Marx, that at the very least, if you're going to encourage the development of such corporations, you need to keep regulations, and sometimes, and failure to observe that, of course, is a disaster. I mean, it's part of what explained It's interesting because China, after all, is a country in Asia, and Marx was a German guy, who lived most of his later life in England, and so in a certain sense, that helps perhaps perpetuate this kind of, or not perpetuate, but expand this notion of globalization on a thought level, on the level of thought, thinking. How else? I mean, it's sort of, it anchors what's being done. It's just, it's an industrial, and what, especially, how can you put urbanizing giant? Making the big cities are so big and so impressive and so overwhelming in many ways. I remember as we drove in from the airport in Shanghai, he was just blown away by how much larger it appeared even than, let's say, Chicago, which is the second, maybe now the third largest city in the United States. And I mean, it's the urbanization which is overwhelming.